Hi, my name is Zandile Mqwati. I'm a trained drama therapist, and that means we use art for healing and development. In this module, we're going to discuss the importance of reflecting on and consolidating course material. So as a life orientation lecturer, your ultimate goal is to get your students thinking and debating on a range of topics. So the essence here, you are really facilitating the aha moments and to get the students come to the conclusions by themselves. This is very, very vital. Students are more likely to connect with an idea or an argument if they are given the tools to reach their own understanding. So as a life orientation lecturer, you are providing your students with tools to consolidate their own learnings and to assess the validity on the arguments presented. Whether those arguments are from fellow classmates or their own, really it doesn't matter. Remember, your role is not to favor certain arguments or views, but to guide your students in validating or challenging their own views. So, how do we get to this incredibly important stage of the learning process? Once the lesson has ended, ask your students what they thought of it. You can do this through a simple process. Make sure your students understood the content by asking the questions after each and every lesson. But don't be too blunt. It's unlikely that standing in front of a large group and saying, "Is there anything you don't understand?" is going to get a response from any of your students. Rather, select students and ask them, what was the most challenging concept for you to grasp? Or do you have an opinion on this lesson? The answers may require you to go over certain concept again to ensure understanding. Perhaps you need to explain something differently. Perhaps you use an example that relates to a certain student's life so that they can visualize the concept. These responses are useful as they allow the students to raise concerns, and they will also help you with your own teaching methods. They will help you to also learn more about how your students learn. Secondly, once you've assessed understanding, you can move on to looking at the arguments made. Did your students agree with the angle of the subject matter? Did they disagree? And if they did, what did they disagree with? What arguments are valid arguments and what arguments are invalid? This process of unpacking is important for students as it helps them both personally and logically on the topics that have been discussed, allowing them to continue learning outside of the classroom, which is very important. It's also important that you are also able to identify which arguments are valid, whether objective or subjective. And this takes an understanding of an argument. The better you understand the theory of arguments, the better you can facilitate this unpacking process. For an example, you may find students engage in circular reasoning. This is where students repeat what they already know beforehand without arriving at any conclusion. Here's an example of a circular reasoning. Taking drugs is against the law because it is wrong. I know it is wrong because it is against the law. If a student comes out of a lesson with this argument, they haven't learned much at all. So provoke a deeper understanding with your students. You can ask questions like, why do we perceive substance abuse as wrong? Or why do we put blame on the abuser? Why do we assume that everything that is illegal is right? So this will get your students to think about why they believe certain things and why do they have certain opinions. This insight gives your students a new, better understanding of themselves, and it also opens up new learning opportunities. Third, once your students have understood the content and grappled with the arguments here, ask them what they have learned. This is very important. Has anything changed their mind? Has their perception changed? Or are they leaving the classroom with a different perspective? Was something revealed to them that they had never thought of before? Or maybe, did another student help them see things differently? This is all part of the reflection process. Engaging students with questions like these forces them to think critically about the lesson and to reflect on their own opinions, as well as the opinions of others. So encourage them to share their points of view and whether the lesson affected them or not. And if the lesson didn't affect their own views, why didn't it? So to summarize, how do you end a lesson? Well, there are only 3 points to end this. And to remember, 1. Make sure students understood the lesson. And 2. Identify the core aims, arguments, and outcomes of the lesson. 3. Provoke students to reflect on the outcomes of the lesson. If you can end off each lesson through this process of consolidation, you have succeeded in the most difficult part of life orientation lecturing, getting your students to reflect, think, and come to conclusions by themselves. This is why it is important to end your lesson by asking your students to reflect on what they have learned. So, take a moment now to reflect on what you have learned. What have you learned from this module? Has your opinion changed? Or do you have a different perspective on teaching after watching this module? If so, why? Reflection is all part of a learning process, whether you're a student, a teacher, young or old. So for the best results with your students, help them to seek a deeper understanding from your lesson. And you can do it by simply asking them to reflect on what they have learned. Thank you so much for joining me in this module. My name is Zandile Mkwati and I'm a drama therapist.